Hello and welcome to the Rippling Pages podcast. My name is Liam Bishop and this is the podcast where we craft and curate conversations with the world's most interesting writers to inspire you and your writing. This is some extra bonus content from my interview with Kimberly Campanello, and what you're going to hear is Kimberly talking about memory and how that differs, whether she's writing prose or poetry. And then you're going to hear something new. I've asked Kimberly to provide me with some objects that represent the writing of the book. Use the words you have. So it's not meant to sentimentalise the process of writing, but it's hopefully a way for us to understand who Kimberly is as a writer. So you'll be able to see what those objects are on our Rippling Pages social media. That's at Rippling_pages, whether you're on Instagram, X or TikTok. And you of course can buy the book Use the Words You Have, published by Somesuch Editions from the Rippling Pages bookshop. That's on bookshop.org.uk, and a link to that shop is in the show notes. Thanks once again for joining me on the Rippling Pages. If you enjoy this episode, or of course any other episodes of the podcast, please leave a review on your favourite podcast provider. Let me know what you like about the show. Let me know perhaps who you'd like to see on the show. And if not, if you don't have a chance to do that, just please tell your friends about the Rippling Pages. Okay, let's get into it. This is Kimberly Campanello on Use the Words You Have. Proust's novel is all about memory. And this isn't a question about what's real and what's not real. Because we're talking about language here, you know, how language represents or doesn't represent. But because this word autofiction, it gets bandied around and it's used.
Yeah.
Does this autofictional experience give an access to memory that other forms don't?
I mean, I suppose that's what makes it more like a poem. You know, it makes it more kind of like a lyric poem, the traditional sense of a lyric as a kind of overheard interior life or an uttered sort of freezing of a moment in time. You know, so Jonathan Kohler's written a lot about lyric poetry and theory of lyric, although apparently he's revising that as we speak, his sense of that. But I mean, it's that sense of the gesture of the self, which is a very romantic tradition of, you know, the I as being a kind of continuous thing, and that gets wrapped up with the I as a genius who has these special feelings, which then gets undermined. You know, I'm going to speak in very broad brush here, but in the 20th century around the idea that, you know, well, we're actually multiple and we exist in relation to each other and our contexts and our languages and everything else. So the idea of a kind of continuous K or continuous me can't really exist, even scientifically speaking. And so some literature tries to sort of acknowledge that, and writers try to acknowledge that intersubjectivity and that slipperiness, which is not to say that lyrics aren't intersubjective. I just think that they do ask for that suspension a lot of the time. And they do tend to occupy a space of sort of wisdom, you know, and not that there's anything wrong with wisdom, but I think so for me, I feel like when I'm writing, I'm always kind of slipping either a character or a poetic speaker in and out of those positions, because I think that's actually what's happening most of the time. You know, you don't hand over sort of authority to a single person for your entire sense of everything, which is what sometimes poetry demands of its readers. The idea of the kind of bardic I.
Well, this is a sort of segue into a new segment we're doing on the Rippling Pages, and I've asked the writer to provide me with some objects that represent the writing of the book we're talking about. So it's not sentimentalize the process of being a writer, but just understand who you are as a writer a bit more and think about influence in a different way. There's there's a couple of other things that you have provided with me, and they relate to the place where this novel is set, Bretagne. And one is a flag, and then you've also got a song, and then also there's a video that you've provided. So I don't know if you can just explain these objects, but maybe just explain Bretagne, because it's where the novel is set.
Yeah, so it's set in Brittany or Bretagne, where they speak Breton is the language, or it's known as Brise in the Breton language, and the language is known as Brisenig. It's one of the Celtic nations, and the language is probably most closely related to Welsh, if we were to pick, and Cornish, and to Manx, because they're all kind of quite close by. So in Brittany, there's always been a sense of, and there's historically been, it's been independent. It was the dukes of Brittany. And then it gets incorporated into France, and there's various sort of battles and fights over these sorts of things, as there were historically in Europe in many places, because the nation state is a fairly new invention. But when Kay goes there, she doesn't really know that that's a thing, because you don't learn this in French class, or I didn't. And so she learns that the family she's with are kind of like Breton separatists, which exist, like sort of not to the extent the Basque separatists might take things, but they did exist. And there was a kind of revival in the 1970s of the Breton language, because it had been sort of literally beaten out of people, but had been many of the people who died in the First World War were kind of cannon fodder, Breton speakers. They didn't speak French at all. And so many of the minority languages, in fact, of Europe were fairly nearly decimated in the First World War, because they tended to be the populations that didn't have sort of officer training or education. So, one of the things in Brittany that's very distinctive is its music, and they're called Fest Noz, which are these big parties where you dance in circles, which for Kay is not a million miles away from the tarantella that she does at Italian American weddings, and we still do. The dance that is this kind of spider dance, or is to kind of dance to Dionysus, which came from the Greek roots of southern Italy. So essentially, the Fest Noz has these traditional musicians, which in the 70s began to revive quite a few of the traditional Breton songs. And so one of the ones, the link I sent you, is Alain Stivell, and he plays the harp, and he's singing in Breton. He's singing this song about these sailors who have to immigrate to Newfoundland, and they're when they get there, they meet someone from back home, and this young woman, and so it's a love story, but it's through language. And so I really like that, because it's got the immigration, it's got the cross sort of sea kind of element. Kay is hearing a lot of this music and goes to a lot of these concerts with the family, because this is part of what they do on their weekends, and she learns the dances, and she learns about the kind of distinctive culture, but also the rejection of kind of French hegemony, and the kind of ways in which power is meted out in a kind of regional way. And of course, you don't think about that when you're from the Midwest. We call it flyover country, but it's part of how we find ourselves where we are now, in the sense that the kind of periphery, and what's thought to be the periphery, can often be an extremely wounded place, and the way those wounds play out are not always the way we'd want them to play out. And so I think for her, this becomes a sense of, oh, maybe being from a certain place isn't quite what I think it is. The center and the periphery are not actually the way to think of things. And then the flag, of course, the flag of Brittany is the black and white flag, and it's the La Blanche Hermine. So that's a gesture to Anne de Bretagne, who was one of the last sort of people to be in charge of an independent Brittany. When you first go out of your wherever you're from, you often are interested to learn, and as a teenager, that, oh wait, they're just telling me one track of French history, let alone American history. So that becomes a big part of it, and the music's brilliant. I mean, especially the 1970s sort of revival, Trian, and Alain Stivell, because they're trying to do this kind of Celtic rock, but it's the 70s, so their hair is amazing and their clothes are amazing.
We'll put the links to these in the show notes, and I think for me, it just communal idea of people creating a song, and the context within Alain Stivell is that story that it's about. So they go to Newfoundland, which is Canada, and they find someone they know, and it's that
these sailors.
uncanniness. Yeah, it's just that sheer uncanniness, and it's kind of what Kay experiences. She finds a home that's not really a home, and she seems to enjoy the whole experience, even though it's very different to her Indiana.
Yeah, I think what you get is that sense in the book is the sea and the sun and the summer are a big part of it, and it takes off the Arthur Rimbaud's lines, Se retrouver quoi l'éternité, c'est la mer aller avec le soleil. It's found again what eternity. It's the sea mixed with the sun, or it's the sea gone off with the sun. So you get this feeling throughout the book that she's experiencing the landscape, but then in these songs where you have people having to immigrate to Newfoundland for work, and then because it's being performed, back in Brittany, it's kind of funny because they're like, oh, there's a meet this girl, and then she's like, oh wait, we know each other from the market. Which market? The one in Nantes. So there's like a kind of a twist to it that feels like that sense of summer love, but also feels like the way of language traveling and across the sea, quite literally, but also not always in an uncomplicated way, um, but in a kind of knowing way. And so I think she starts reading into things that maybe she would have assumed she couldn't figure out. And I think that that's part of her process. Is nothing is at face value when you really start listening, I suppose, is what she starts figuring out.
And that is one thing that's present in all of your work that I've interacted with, is beneath the surface there are other languages, other cultures trying to break through, influence, repressed or hidden. Or
Yeah, I mean, I think it's that thing of like, Kay writes a bit about her Italian American background, but it's only, or she's reflecting upon it, but it's only after she started to have certain experiences that she can see, kind of what she was experiencing all along. She begins to see things in a different way, even things that she thinks are familiar. And I think that that's what poetry does. That's what literature does, full stop, but especially kind of poetic language, which learning another language is a kind of poetic language, because that's why when we say things, when we're speaking another language, people are like, oh, that's so interesting, right? Look what you just did there. How did you manage that sort of turn of phrase? And so it's taking you back to the root of language, which is building something new. And I think she starts having that experience again. And so she's able to see her own life as a kind of more shifting sands that isn't to be feared, but is in fact to be enjoyed and sort of made.